Afternoon and welcome. I'm Raleigh Flynn. I'm the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a nonpartisan think tank, 501c3, and we're based in Philadelphia. Today we are going to have a conversation with Robert Kaplan and Michael, also known as Misha Auslin, about his new book, Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-Pacific. We're going to have a conversation about that, as well as I think it'll probably turn out to be pretty far-ranging. Before I introduce our two conversants, I would like to just say a few words about FPRI. We depend heavily on your support, and we're grateful to those of our members and sponsors who are in the audience today, or those who are not. And a few housekeeping notes. At the bottom of your screen, if you look down, you'll see a chat button. If you click on that, you can put questions into the screen that's going to pop up on the right side of your computer. And we will have a Q&A portion at the end of today's event. So please, as we go along, put your questions in there. So let me go ahead and introduce Michael Auslin is the Payson J. Treat Distinguished Research Fellow in Contemporary Asia at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. He's a historian by training and specializes in U.S. policy in Asia and geopolitical issues in the Indo-Pacific. His latest book, as I mentioned, Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-War, but he's also the author of the best-selling The End of the Asian Century, War, Stagnation, and the Risks to the World's Most Dynamic Region. He's written a lot of other books and edited volumes as well, and is a long-time contributor to the Wall Street Journal, the National Review, and his writing frequently appears in other major publications. He comments regularly for U.S. and foreign and domestic print and broadcast media as well. He was previously an associate professor at Yale, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and a visiting professor at University of Tokyo. He's also, I don't know how I listed this at the bottom, but he's also a senior fellow at FPRI, and we're very grateful to have him with us. He's also a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and a senior, I already said that, excuse me. He's been named a Young Global Leader by the World Economic Forum, was a Fulbright Scholar, and a Marshall Memorial Fellow by the German Marshall Fund. He has a Bachelor of Science from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and his PhD in history from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Bob Kaplan, very happy to say he is now the Robert Strausz-Hupé Chair in Geopolitics at FPRI and a member of our Board of Advisors. He's also the best-selling author of 19 books, including The Good American about Robert Gussoni, which is being published this fall. He's also written The Coming Anarchy, Balkan Ghosts, Asia's Cauldron, Monsoon, and the Revenge of Geography. For 3 decades, he reported on foreign affairs for The Atlantic, and his articles appear frequently in major publications such as the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, both in the US and internationally. He was previously a senior advisor at Eurasia Group, the chief geopolitical analyst at Stratfor, a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, senior fellow at the Center for a New America Security, and a member of the Pentagon's Defense Policy Board and the U.S. Navy's executive panel. Foreign Policy magazine twice named him as one of the world's top 100 global thinkers. And New York Times columnist Thomas Friedman has called him among the 4 most widely read authors defining the post-Cold War. In the 1980s, he was the first American writer to warn in print about a future war in the Balkans, and Balkan Ghosts, his book, about this was chosen by the New York Times Book Review as one of the best books of 1993. He was also given the Distinguished Alumni Award by the University of Connecticut And very important to us, in 2009, he was also given FPRI's Benjamin Franklin Public Service Award in Philadelphia. So without further ado, let me turn this over to you, Bob.
Well, thank you very much, Raleigh. It's a great pleasure to be here with my friend Misha Auslin. And today we're going to discuss his new book, which is a collection of essays, but it's around a real muscular theme. The title is Asia's New Geopolitics, Essays on Reshaping the Indo-Pacific, with a foreword by the great historian Neil Ferguson. Now, this collection of essays is very dear to me because Misha and I, years ago, very separately, were writing about what he called the Indo-Pacific and what I called the Greater Indian Ocean, but it was the same thing. And what he was calling Asia's Mediterranean, i.e. the South China Sea, and I was calling China's Caribbean, because I called the Caribbean the American Mediterranean. So what we're really talking about is something vital yet imaginable in breaking down East Asia into organizable sort of entities that you could really grapple with. Now, he's got some really major themes in here, and I'm going to let him introduce the book, but I want to let you know that towards the end of my discussion, I want to draw Misha out on his last essay in the book, which is a mind blower. It's a war scenario between the US and China in 2025, which is actually very believable. It makes the unimaginable very imaginable. So let me turn it over to Misha for a few minutes. Misha, you obviously had to choose among many essays in terms of what to include here. So give us a sense of the theme of the book as a collection of essays about Asia.
Well, thank you, Bob. First of all, let me say thank you to Raleigh and to FPRI. Of course, my most important affiliation is as a senior fellow at FPRI, and it's a thrill to be able to talk to the community virtually, unfortunately not in person, but to join you again, and of course to join my old friend and my good friend, Bob Kaplan, who for any of us who are writing about geopolitics, foreign policy, US strategy, Bob is the touchstone, and he is the one who guides us in thinking not only about the diplomatic side and the strategic side, but of course the military side. So it's a real thrill. It's an honor to be here with him and do this today. The essays, well, first of all, it was an experiment. I had never done a book of essays. And I had done the essays themselves, as we all do, but I had written books that were either history narratives or, as in the last book I wrote, a narrative about contemporary events. But there's so many things that, essays are a world of their own, and they can stand on their own. And so I really wanted to try to bring to attention some things that I thought were important that get lost in the larger question. The big rubric, I think, and this is something that when you talk to Bob, you just say, well, of course, is that we have to think geographically again. In the post-Cold War period, we lost a geographic sense of the world, partly because we felt we were at the end of history, so we didn't have to think about the world in the same set of challenges as we had from the Cold War. And secondly, what Bob covered a great deal, of course, which was the revolution in military affairs, where we thought, well, you know what, we can just project power wherever we want, whenever we want. And again, geography is not the insuperable obstacle that it has always been. So we stopped thinking about how regions are defined and how we need to act within them, or how other nations take account of them. But if you, and I'm an Asianist, so if you deal with Asia, and you deal, of course, in the past decade and a half with China, you realize that it's all about geography for China. Every strategy that China has is actually a geostrategy designed to change the geopolitical environment, whether we're talking about in the South China Sea, what they would call the first and second island chains, or the One Belt and One Road, which is a land-based attempt to link Eurasia together. What they've done in many ways is link both Mackinder and Spikeman. Mackinder with his focus on the land-based heartland, and Spikeman with his focus on the marginal seas, or the littoral, the rimlands. And so you had to think more about how other nations in the region were affected by and thinking about China. So that's really the choices of a lot of the essays, but I wanted to talk about US strategy in the region. I'm a historian by training. I was a historian at Yale. I wanted to bring history to bear and do some long essays on the history of America in the Indo-Pacific. And it was Indo to us before it was Pacific, because we went through the Indian Ocean back in the 18th century. I wanted to talk about how Japan has engaged with modernity based on its historical tradition. I wanted to talk about the history of nuclear weapons and how difficult it is to keep them safe. And therefore, when we think about Kim Jong-un, we have to think not about his desire to use them, but about whether he can simply keep them safe. I have an essay on Indian women, and in the light of India's modernization and globalization, how they are being kept from playing a fuller role. So all of these different essays combined, by the way, about the Sino-Japanese competition over centuries, if not millennia, in Asia. All of these combined, I think, in my mind at least, to bring together history and geography. And that's really what I hope people get out of the collection.
Yes. All right, Misha, first question. All right, first kind of mega question is what you say something very profound in the book, which is that the United States has not had a competitor in the air or at sea since World War II, and China is changing that. If you look at the Middle East wars, if you look at the Vietnam War, if you look at any war where the US has been engaged, it's always been dirty land battles, whether in deserts or in jungles. And when it came to air and sea, we patrolled the commons. We essentially patrolled the earth almost, essentially, with no competitors. We kept the choke points open for commerce, the navigable choke points, the Persian Gulf, the Strait of Malacca, etc. You're saying that's changed now, that the Chinese are back and they can be a competitor for us in the air and also at sea.
Absolutely. I think that it goes back to the question of strategy, I think, and that's what to me was so interesting. It's easy to have strategy or to think you have a strategy or to think your strategy is successful when you don't really have a challenger. So as we thought about Asia post 1945, where there was no real challenger for supremacy in any particular way, where instead, in fact, we were so dominant that even the Soviet Union was a sideshow to what was going on in Europe, of course, that we didn't have to think, I think, quite as much. It's certainly in a geopolitical sense. Now, we did get involved in the two hot wars during the Cold War. We're both in Asia, obviously, Korea and Vietnam. But in terms of a systemic challenger like the Soviet Union, we really didn't have one. And then, of course, we went through, I would say, the first decade of the 2000s with things beginning to change, but not so significantly that we would suddenly believe that everything was up for grabs. And then really around 2010, it begins to change and in a more fundamental way. Now, part of that change is due precisely to the dominance that we had. If we go back to the 1996 Taiwan Strait crisis, where Bill Clinton sent in 2 aircraft carrier groups to basically warn Beijing to back down from intimidating Taiwan over its elections. Beijing took a very clear strategic message from that, which is if they wanted to have strategic space and strategic flexibility in their own neighborhood, they would have to build a military that could challenge United States strength. And that's exactly what they did. So it was precisely our dominance that caused a reaction, in a sense, a chain reaction. But it was suddenly, if you were in DC, where I live and work, around 2010 or so, that you could just begin to scent the first faint whiffs of panic, that something really fundamental was changing in a way that we had not thought about since 1945, since the Japanese, really, to be honest, since probably 1944 in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, that there could be a challenger on the sea that for a United States Navy that had not had a major naval battle since 1944, 1945, would suddenly find itself with a near-peer competitor. Same thing with the air, by the way, that we had taken for granted that since 1952, I think it was 52 or 53, whichever year it was, the last American troop killed by enemy air fire was in Korea. So for a period of a half century, we had never had to worry about the ability of our troops to get onto land and not be attacked from the air. And all of a sudden that was changing too. My point is that all of a sudden we had to think about strategy, and all of a sudden we realized that maybe we didn't have such a great strategy, because we began to be very concerned about our ability to maintain not only the global commons, but our position. This is what has dominated thinking in DC since about 2010 in the Obama administration, and it's what the Trump administration has taken up with its free and open Indo-Pacific. And I still think, Bob, we're at the beginning of it. We have not fully come to grips with what this challenge means to us, but it does mean that what we thought was strategy may not have really been strategy, but luck.
And yes, and the follow-on from that is, how do we accommodate China in the Indo-Pacific, particularly in the Western Pacific? Because for decades, essentially, the Western Pacific was an American naval lake. Even in Vietnam, there was no issue that we dominated the seas in the air. What hurt us was we couldn't dominate the ground. That's a whole other story. But the Western Pacific for decades was an acknowledged American naval lake, and that no longer exists, as the Chinese Navy has arisen, and that in turn has led to a chain reaction where Japan, Singapore, other powers have built their own navies, maybe small by comparison, but still, it's much more of a multipolar naval and air environment than it was 15 years ago, say. So my question is, how does the United States start to think about just how we accommodate the Chinese? Because we can't tell them to go home. They're there, they're at sea. We're going to have to share the Western Pacific with them.
Well, it's a great question, and it's one I know that people in Washington struggle with. If you look back at the Cold War, we were able to come to certain agreements with the Soviets over incidents at sea, for example, ways of ensuring that at what we call the steady state, pre-conflict, where tensions are manageable, that you don't wind up getting into a situation of accidents that worsen relations and may themselves spin out of control. We don't have that with the Chinese. In fact, one of the things that we've seen as the Chinese military and the Chinese Navy and Air Force have grown in capability, so moving from being essentially a coastal defense force into a blue water Navy or a combined air-sea operations military, that they become far more assertive. They become more aggressive. Of course, in 2001, one of our planes, an EP-3, was knocked out of the sky. We've seen the video of Chinese ships coming dangerously close. We have reports, of course, of Chinese naval ships ramming the Vietnamese fishing boats or Philippines fishing boats. So they are acting in ways that are throwing their elbows around. This is like old-fashioned elbow throwing on the school, on the school courtyard, and you have to do everything that you can to make clear to Beijing that this is not in its interest, because what they're seeing, as you point out, Bob, is the reaction of countries like Japan, which actually has a phenomenal Navy and Coast Guard, and it's building aircraft carriers. They call them helicopter carriers, but those are F-35B aircraft carriers that are being built, and they're big. They're getting F-35s. India is the largest procurer of naval equipment in the world during this decade. So what Beijing has actually done has been to cause a reaction on the part of those around it, and the United States has maintained, I think, its credibility among its allies, in that we have not reduced our presence in the Pacific. What we have to do, though, to your point, is figure out ways of working even more in concert with a community of maritime and aerial-minded nations in order to keep open the sea lanes and the air lanes. And that's where things get a little sticky, because people don't want to be seen as choosing in between the two.
That brings me to my next question. Again, based on your essays in this book, you're a Japan expert. I mean, how does Japan, a middle-level power, we'll call it, balance between the US and China? Because though they're a treaty ally of the United States is still a half a world away. Whereas China is big, it's next door, It's the organizing principle of Asia, no matter how you cut it, economic, geographic, demographic. China ain't going away, you know? So, and as long as the US and China had a civil, predictable relationship, Japan got along, Japan was able to maneuver. So was Australia, by the way, and so were other countries. But now that the US-China relationship is less predictable, it's more contentious, it's frankly hostile. How does a country like Japan, what are its options going forward?
Another great question. So I think we have to distinguish between China's several phases of China's growth. First was the phase of attaining capabilities that would give it strategic space, literally being able to sail away from sight of land or fly away from sight of land, so that you could maintain operations throughout your near seas, what Spikeman called the inner seas, or the marginal seas, the seas on the margins, let alone out into a blue water navy that could go, as they do now, across the Indian Ocean, even into, of course, the Mediterranean. So the first part was getting capability. The second part of the strategy, of course, was then being able to assert claims over territories that you wanted, not because the territories themselves were inherently important, but because they gave you strategic access. So essentially turning the South China Sea into a Chinese lake in terms of its ability to control it, vis-a-vis these other much smaller naval nations, as you point out, or aerial nations, was the second point of the strategy. Why would they build these small islands in the South China Sea? Because it gives them access throughout the region. Why then would they build bases or attain basing rights throughout Southeast Asia, then into the Indian Ocean, what we used to call the String of Pearls? The same thing. It follows the Maritime Silk Road, and it allows Beijing to have access through these strategic choke points. The third part then, though, would be sort of where your question's going, and that is, what about taking away contested territory and contested land? Now, China has done that. Beijing has done that against smaller, weaker nations, particularly the Philippines, taking away the Scarborough Shoal in 2012. Before that, taking away the Paracel, some of the Paracel Islands in the early 1990s, after we left the Philippines. The answer, I think, for the nations in the region is that, so when we talk about the US, as you point out, Bob, we're far away. It's an away game for us, and we have to steam several weeks, either from Hawaii or even farther from the West Coast, to get into the area where the action is. For China, of course, it's all concentrated there, but if you think about the different types of challenges it has, whether it's the Senkakus, the Spratlys, the Paracels, it also would actually be spread fairly far. So I think that the answer for the smaller nations is quite simply a porcupine strategy. You have to be strategically defensible enough that you will incur on the Chinese, or the Chinese will incur enough pain that it changes the calculation of what they're willing to do. Some nations are doing this. The Vietnamese are good at this. The Singaporeans are good at this. The Japanese are good at this. Other nations are not as good. Clearly, the Philippines, the Malaysians, the Indonesians. So I think the work that we should be doing with both our allies and our partners is building up these porcupine capabilities of nations. They're not going to have aircraft carriers, but they can change the calculation of China with anti-ship missiles, cruise missiles, even supersonic cruise missiles, missile boats, and the like. That's where we really have to be, so that Beijing suddenly realizes that, of course, it can overwhelm any one, but it can't overwhelm them all. And as it acts in a way that's threatening, it is going to have basically a balancing effect come into play against it.
Okay, to change the subject a bit, will U.S. business interests now dislodge from China, move their supply chains? Has this story been exaggerated somewhat in the news? Can they dislodge completely, or do they have to tinker? Because even a place like Vietnam, which has been touted as the replacement to China, can't be a replacement. It's too small. It doesn't have the capacity. It could be maybe a 10% replacement, but that's about it. So how are they going to have to operate going forward, given that the U.S.-China relationship even with a new president in November or in January, is not going to be going back to like Obama and the normal previous decades.
Right. This is a very important question. It is, first of all, we should remember that the decoupling, as it's called, was beginning before the COVID-19 crisis, the pandemic that began in Wuhan, China. If you remember back, first of all, everyone thought that the trade war was going to lead to this great decoupling. And there were major stories in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and the New York Times about the decoupling process. It had already become clear to US business that the playing field in China was no longer, it had never been level, but it was now level unlevel in a way that you could not ignore, that was deleterious to your own interests. So it was beginning this attempt to figure out how do we decouple. The COVID pandemic that began in Wuhan simply accelerated this as it became clear that globalization entails vulnerabilities that we had not fully appreciated and anticipated for supply chains. I'm sure as you, because I know you talk with business a great deal, but I would be talking with business folks who would say, I have no idea when my factories are opening up on the mainland. So they understood now there were vulnerabilities. I think the answer here is strategic decoupling. You're right. There's no way to fully decouple, certainly not in the short run or even medium run. But I also think, by the way, we should not shy away from decoupling. What's actually happened over the past 40 years has been an incredibly unbalanced development of the world economy, meaning China has become so dominant in all of these production chains and all of these different spheres of the production process, that it meant that countries like Vietnam and Malaysia and others, and India and whomever you want to put in there, actually found it difficult to move up the value-added chain. It was actually an unbalanced situation. And so decoupling will be healthy, I think, for the global economy. It does not mean it won't be messy. It doesn't mean it won't be expensive, that there will be costs and inefficiencies, but in the long run, it'll be far more healthy, and in part because China, it was slowing down through demographics, through macroeconomic slowdown. It was becoming a middle income country. All of this was going to push it to some degree. So again, the answer, I think, is strategic decoupling. We can never again become dependent on China for things like medicines, which we are. The fact that we have no antibiotics that are made in this country, none of the acetaminophen, none of the heparin, the blood thinning medication, all of this, that should not be in Chinese hands. Personal protective equipment, all of that. So it's strategic decoupling, rare earths as well, and the Pentagon is beginning to open up rare earths development. All of that needs to be done, and you're right. The question is it overhyped that business will do it? Quite possibly. That's where I think government needs to step in. Not for everything, not for Nikes. We don't care about the Nikes. What we care about is the medicines, the protective equipment, the rare earths, and if business won't do it, and making clear that it is doing it, then I think you actually do need government to come in and say, we are mandating that a certain amount of this is made here so that we have strategic flexibility.
Okay, I'm going to ask you quickly about Korea, and then I want to give you a few minutes to talk about your war scenario, because we've got 17 questions lined up. So okay. I want to get over to the questions sooner rather than later. Quick question on Korea, Misha. You talk about, it's not a question of do they have nuclear weapons. The question is, can they control them? Because controlling a nuclear arsenal is not so easy. It's very complicated, it's bureaucratic. There are various links in the chain, in order to do something. It's easy to make mistakes, etc. So just talk quickly about that, please.
Yeah, it's as you point out, and this was a real history chapter of going back into the Cold War and looking at how both the United States and the Soviet Union dealt with what is called nuclear surety or nuclear safety. I interviewed the former head of Strategic Command and the deputy commander. I interviewed ballistic missile sub-commanders, missileers, and they all had the same message, which is that the hardest thing to do is keep the weapons safe, make sure that the people are trained, make sure all of the security protocols are in place. We had dozens and dozens of accidents during the Cold War. We had a fully loaded ballistic missile, Titan II, in Arkansas explode in its silo because of a refueling accident in 1980 and eject the warhead. We almost came to war with the Soviet Union. They almost launched against us because they misinterpreted, or their systems misinterpreted satellite data. It is very hard to maintain a safe nuclear arsenal. We lost 6 nuclear weapons, warheads, during the Cold War. We don't know where they are. They disappeared into the marshes of North Carolina and South Carolina. So the question is, how will the North Koreans manage this safely? It's very simple. We have no idea how safe their weapons design system is. Does it have multiple safety mechanisms? Who has the authority to launch? How well trained are their disaster crisis teams, if they even have them? Who will be able to decide whether or not they see a B-52 circling that it's an attack? What if the phone line goes down and a missile commander thinks that that's been an attack? I'm not as worried, and talking to the nuclear people after that, I'm not as worried that Kim Jong-un is going to wake up and say, I'm going to nuke LA or Philadelphia. That makes no sense. It's possible, but it makes no sense. Much more likely is that there's an accident. Someone isn't doing the job right. There's an accidental launch. There's an explosion that they could blame us for. And before you know it, we could be involved in the world's gravest nuclear crisis because no one was willing to go to the dear leader and say to him, our weapons are unsafe.
Yeah. Okay, war scenario, 2025. This is a long essay or chapter. It's the final essay or chapter. It starts out as fanciful, but as you read it, you can imagine it actually taking place. It takes it, in other words, it takes a U.S.-China naval war out of the realm of the abstract, and it gives it a trajectory all of its own, where the leaders in each country, recognizing that things are getting out of hand, are still burdened by the need to project status and strength and other considerations, and we haven't even spoken about the financial effects of a war between the U.S. and China in the South China Sea would tank stock markets in a way that the war in Iraq, Libya, Syria had zero effect on it practically. Right. And it would be a systems war, a cyber systems war as well. So why don't you just, try to give us a feel, a nuts and bolts feel, because everyone, folks, you've got to read this chapter.
Well, thank you. I would just say that for those who have probably read some other war scenarios between China and the US, mine is different in the sense that I took it from what has already happened. The whole scenario unravels or unrolls itself due to accidents. I don't believe that the likelihood of a US-China war, which is possible, but I don't think particularly probable, would be because Beijing, and even less, Washington, decided they needed to attack. And so the scenarios that you may have seen where suddenly there's a blanket cyber attack that brings down the entire grid, or there are container ships where suddenly all these missiles come flying out of, that's when you've decided you're going to have a Pearl Harbor. I don't think, as I read the headlines and also be a historian, that's how it's going to happen. It's going to happen because we're going to have another 2001 EP3 incident. It's going to happen because we're going to have a US ship that is unfortunately rammed by a Chinese ship, as they've done to other nations, and there will be loss of life, and that will spin out of control. So the scenario is based on accident, when neither side is ready for a war or particularly wants a war. But once the hostilities have begun, in the fog of war, in the confusion of war, and the Japanese are also involved, then it becomes very hard to back down. What I see is that there is a great risk averseness on the part of both China, both Beijing, and the US to escalating the war either horizontally or vertically. Let me just explain that for a second. By the way, the president in the scenario is Gavin Newsom, and the defense secretary is Michelle Flournoy. So it's a Democratic administration. And they are trying to protect our allies. Another thing that we've done, it's trying to show credibility to the Philippines, and we get involved in accidents with the Chinese. But we're very concerned, as is Xi Jinping, not to escalate vertically or horizontally. The horizontal escalation is they don't want it to spread to other islands or to the mainland. It's very hard to control when that happens. And so the concentration of war takes place already at the sites where conflict has happened. And there are different battle sites throughout the East and South China Seas where the forces are in proximity. It is an older fashioned model of war. It's a 20th century model, but I think it's the most likely. Similarly, they don't vertically escalate, meaning they don't go full cyber because they're very worried that a full cyber attack and you cripple an economy means that the adversary will have no choice but to go nuclear. They're very worried, by the way, about attacking the land-based horizontal escalation from the US, from Chinese missiles, because they're worried that the Chinese may go nuclear against American bases. So both sides are constrained in certain ways by this, and yet they are fighting with the full forces that they have. And quite frankly, the Chinese get the best of us. And that is based on a lot of war games that people have either participated in or read about, that we don't do very well in these war games. I find us doing better in the air scenario than in the sea scenario. And it's difficult because the weapons that the Chinese have built at sea, swarming missile boats, are very hard to defend against. In the air, you have more of a parity. And in that case, I think the US would maintain initial air superiority. There's two calculations for both sides. One for the Chinese is, when do all of the other US forces come into play? When do they get there from San Diego and Bremerton and Washington? That's when Xi Jinping says enough. We've attained our superiority enough that the US is going to agree to basically halt hostilities where we're in control of the South China Sea. And for the US, the calculation is the same thing. It cannot escalate onto the land, land-based attacks, which limit what it can do to protect its ships, because the Chinese may go farther and start attacking Hawaii, and then it's Dr. Strangelove time. So
again, it's still a war of limits. Both sides.
I believe it's a war of limits.
Both sides are obsessed with limits, and it's a war that starts behind the times, as many wars do, with old. It's not so high tech. It's just like throughout the nuclear age, there was never another atomic bomb dropped after Nagasaki. It was, a lot of like dirty insurgencies that really defined the Cold War for decades. So you're saying a war between the US and China may be more similar to like the Battle of the Philippine Sea or something like that in World War II. Yeah. Because both sides would be terrified of ramping up.
And yet they can. And that's where the nationalism comes into play. It's where your point about the economics comes into play. That is the concern, and whether it's existential for the Communist Party to be seen to win. Obviously, I'd love people to read the scenario, so I don't want to give all of it away. But the end result is that geopolitically, Asia becomes fractured. And I think that's the most likely scenario, that you will have different blocks. The US will lose some allies, but China then will gain very recalcitrant ally/partners. It's not that that Beijing will suddenly have those countries that defected from the US be happy about it. They felt that they have no choice. So even as Beijing and Washington are trying to figure out what to do, you have other players. You have Tokyo and Seoul and Canberra and Hanoi, all trying to figure out what is going to be in their best interests. And that is, I think, the most likely scenario, as opposed to the Chinese decide to do a cyber Pearl Harbor. I guess that's possible, but they know what that would entail. Much more difficult to work your way through is the accidents that thrust you into a conflict where you really don't know how far the other side is willing to go.
Okay, thank you, Misha. We have 22 questions lined up, if I'm correct. So I'd like to turn it over to someone who will then field the questions and direct them to you. So at least we can get some of them answered within the hour.
Great.
Thank you. What a fascinating discussion that's been, and another reason why FPRI is unique. You don't get this on TV. We have a lot of questions, as Bob indicated. One from Guofu Yang from Voice of America. We haven't touched on Hong Kong. It's in the news today. As you all know, Beijing imposed a wide-reaching national security law on Hong Kong, despite the international decries. Two questions. Why did she choose to do that? Is that because they can get away with that? Namely, the US and the West have little leverage here, And the second question is, what can the West do to make a difference?
Yeah, this is a crucial question. It is something that has been developing in Hong Kong over the past decade plus. This is the final step in what Beijing has been trying to do to essentially end China's autonomy, I'm sorry, Hong Kong's autonomy. And if you heard the news, the first full day of this law, they arrested at least 300 Hong Kongers. So this is not a light touch that they are bringing to this. This is bringing down a mailed fist very early and very quickly. It's part in the book. There is a chapter that I call the New China Rules. It's how China expects the world to basically bow to its wish. And when I say China, I'm talking about Beijing. I'm talking about the Communist Party. Let's be very clear about that. It's how Beijing expects the world to bend to China's wishes and to either self-censor or accept Chinese determinations, the party's determinations of what are going to be the security arrangements and the like. And that goes for Hong Kong as well. Beijing, the party, is flouting the joint declaration, the 1984 agreement with Britain. It is breaking its international word. It has ended Hong Kong's autonomy. The secret police, the MSS, will be operating openly in Hong Kong. And when they work in Hong Kong, by the way, if you read the law, they will not be bound by Hong Kong law. The office that is interpreting how the security how the new security law will be fully enforced in Hong Kong is also not bound by Hong Kong law. So this really, unfortunately, folks, means this is the end of autonomous Hong Kong today. It ended today, and we are in a new world. And the Trump administration is doing the right thing, as are other countries like Britain, in offering what will be essentially asylum and citizenship to members of civil society in Hong Kong. This is going to be crucial in changing Hong Kong's access to US markets. This will be crucial. We basically need to recreate Hong Kong's vibrant civil society outside of Hong Kong, because no one's safe. People who have people of faith in Hong Kong are not safe. People of different gender orientations are not safe. Obviously, scholars are not safe. And Beijing is doing it because the world has never put a cost to Beijing for anything that it's done. Maybe the canary in the coal mine was the Uyghurs, in a way, when 1 million Uyghurs could be put into re-education, reconcentration camps, and the world did nothing. It knew that it could get away with this in Hong Kong. And that's also really the message to Taiwan, which is that if we can do this in Hong Kong, just be prepared for what we're willing to do now against Taiwan. So this is a moment of change, a true moment of change in Asia. And it is, whether or not we accept that Hong Kong is part of China or not, this means that we are going to see geopolitical changes accumulate throughout the region.
Misha, we have a question from Stephen Katz, who's at the Community College of Philadelphia, on another topic in the news. And he asks, is the recent conflict between India and China in the Himalayas all that significant?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it actually leads to a much bigger point than what's happening in the Himalayas. The answer is yes, it's significant, in part because anytime you have loss of life between two armies battling means that, as Bob and I were just talking about, things can spiral out of control. This is an unsettled border. It's called the actual line of control from the 1962 border war. This is over a half century now, almost 60 years of an unsettled border region. There's also the Bhutan unsettled border. What you have are the world's two most populous nations, both nuclear powers, being unable to settle disputes and getting to the point where their militaries, even though it's a demilitarized zone, which is why they were fighting with bats and clubs and stones, at least 20 Indian soldiers were killed, and an unknown number of Chinese. You have to assume some also lost their lives. But the interesting point to Stephen's question, I think, is that it actually shows that Xi Jinping, the General Secretary of the Communist Party, has put Beijing on a path of confrontation with a great number of its neighbors now. They have problems with almost every neighbor except Russia, and that I wouldn't trust that there's actually too much, there's not that much love lost between Moscow and Beijing. between Japan and China, between quite frankly North Korea and China, certainly with the Philippines and Vietnam and others. Beijing has problems with all of its neighbors. Its relations today are worse than they were when Xi Jinping took power, because he has put China on a more aggressive path, a less cooperative path. And this is something that you're hearing grumbling about in China. We know that there is criticism that basically you're having a China that is increasingly friendless. It may be feared, but it certainly is not loved in any way. And so watch what happens not on all of these border areas, with Vietnam, with India, with Japan, and quite honestly, I'd worry about Russia as well if I were the Chinese. So it's a very good and important question.
We have something a little bit similar to that from, where is it there? From Robert Coombs, who's asking, saying China's South China Sea actions have been a little like salami approach to negotiating. It moves a little at a time so that nobody gets too upset with it. And then we realize that it's the whole elephant in the room. Net result is that it has pretty much taken control without any real option. I think he means opposition.
Yeah, I think that's a very good analysis. It also aligns with the economic analysis, which is when you look back at how we thought we'd be integrating China into the world economy, nobody thought that it would be the world's largest or second largest economy in just 30 years. Nobody thought that it would be the largest producer in the world. Nobody thought that it would be the major trade partner of every single country in the world. And it was the same way. It was salami slicing. Now we sliced the salami for it by putting it into the World Trade Organization. And in many ways, we've abetted a lot of its political and I would say even military actions. The Obama administration did very little, if anything, during its term in office to try to change the calculus in the South China Sea of when China was beginning, of when Beijing was beginning to build these islands, of when it was beginning to really intimidate its neighbors. I mean, it would have been a lot easier to deal with a China that was weaker or more uncertain of its position vis-a-vis its neighbors than the China of today. And so salami slicing in some way is right. It's salami sliced the Parasols, it's salami sliced Scarborough Shoal, it's salami sliced the islands that it's built up. In essence, it has achieved the potential. And you know, if you talk to Pacific Command or Indo-Pacific Command and Pacific Fleet out in Hawaii, they will show you these wonderful charts that basically show that all of the goals that it had back in 1996 or 2005 has basically been achieved in terms of being able to control seascape and airscape. That doesn't mean, of course, that, you know, it's a very untested military in many ways. It is not a combat-tested military the way that the United States is, or certainly was after 9/11. But compared to its neighbors, it is an overwhelming force. When we were too risk-averse to do anything to try to change that trajectory, impose some level of cost, and you can have a debate on what that should have been, then you get to the point where you are today with Beijing. And it is much harder to deter it, even though at the same time, as I was just mentioning, it actually then causes for itself a reaction. And a great number of countries being fearing of what it will do next, of trying to bandwagon, not bandwagon with it, but balance against it. And as Bob mentioned at the beginning, build up their own capabilities.
I would just add one quick point, that we made a philosophical error, the whole Washington elite, in assuming that as China got wealthier and more technologically developed, it would become more liberal. And what that was applying the American historical experience to other countries and other civilizations where it was much different.
Absolutely. And then not just the American, Bob, I would say, you know, what we saw with Germany and Japan imposed, but what we saw in Europe and Eastern Europe, I think it's absolutely right. That is the original sin of our China policy going back to 1979. Which doesn't mean that it wasn't worth a try, but what it means is that we never did the due diligence to say, are we on the right trajectory? And if not, what do we do about it? I think that new realism and an era of reciprocity has now taken over. And I think the Trump administration is very clear in its new strategic approach in the national security strategy. This is now a strategy of reciprocity, and that is one that's going to change the way that we react to China. You see it on everything from what's going on in Hong Kong to journalist visas to Huawei and the like.
We have another comment from Mitch Koch, who's a U.S. Naval War College graduate student. He says he'd love to hear your thoughts on how COVID and its economic impact will affect great power competition with China.
Well, I think we talked a little bit about this in terms of decoupling, because that is a huge part of the great power Look, we wouldn't be having a great power competition if China hadn't become so economically powerful, right? Economic power translates into national power, military power. So if China had been where probably most people anticipated it to be, would have built up a military to defend itself, certainly gone beyond the fractured, Maoist era military, and been probably a quite capable defensive force, but not the force that we see today. So I think that the COVID virus, the pandemic, has, of course, exacerbated the economic issue we talked about. It's exacerbated the political issue. The propaganda campaign that Beijing waged against the United States and the world, but quite honestly, most importantly, against the truth about what was happening, the cover-up, the misleading of the World Health Organization. I think it has surrendered an enormous amount of its goodwill that it had built up over decades. And even when some of that goodwill might have been dissipating, nothing like what happened after the coronavirus pandemic. I don't think anyone is going to trust Beijing. I think we're in a new era of putting an asterisk next to what Beijing says, literally, that we only have 3,000 deaths. That's impossible. They had at least 45,000 deaths in Wuhan based on crowdsourcing in Wuhan alone. That there were only 88,000 infections in the country. Absolutely impossible. They've just shut down counties around Beijing again. You have to put an asterisk next to what Beijing says, because you cannot trust it. And we should have known that. That goes back to Bob's point about the philosophy, about how we thought the China that we would get, as opposed to the party that we have, a party that has never been interested in surrendering any power. So all of this is feeding into the great power competition. And let's not forget that the geopolitical jockeying between China and its neighbors, between Beijing and Washington, is going on, even as the world has reeled from the coronavirus epidemic. We've been doing freedom of navigation operations, which is the right thing to do. They've been intimidating the Filipinos and the Vietnamese, the wrong thing to do, intimidating the Chinese, taking away Hong Kong's powers, independence, and not independence, but autonomy, threatening India and getting involved. This has been going on, and I think that no matter how powerful Beijing seems and in control it seems, that the competition is moving into a new phase of a minimum of distrust and wariness, and an increase in pushing back and demanding reciprocity.
We have a lot of questions about sharing the Western Pacific and questions about the Western Pacific and the South China Sea. So I'm going to combine a couple of these. This one with a little different twist from Milia Howe, who's a senior researcher with the UK House of Commons. She asks, how can the Five Eyes countries work together to counterbalance the geopolitical challenge posed by the PRC? And then we also have a question from Brian Duffy, who asks, is it conceivable that China may reach some form of strategic overreach and stall out?
Those are great questions, and I'm just looking over to the side to read them as well and make sure that I get them. First of all, the Five Eyes are crucial, and we were having a lot of problems before this in terms of Huawei and 5G, in terms of getting all of our allies on board, including the Brits. I think it's pretty clear now that the tide has turned on this, that Huawei probably will not be I would think there's a good chance it's not going to be in the UK 5G network. It's not going to be in the Australian network. We need better alignment, which is a hard thing to do. It's easy for me to say. It's harder to get that alignment between the Five Eyes, but you do need it. And I think, again, that Beijing has given us this opportunity. We recognize you cannot trust what it says. It knew about person-to-person transmission of the virus that began in Wuhan back in early January minimum, and so almost certainly December, if not before that. And it misled the world. We could have avoided 99% of this if it had done what it was legally bound to do under the international health regulations that it signed. It didn't do any of that. So I think the Five Eyes are going to be much more aligned. Australia has finally woken up and taking the lead in trying to limit China's, Beijing's influence operations and propaganda operations. The Trump administration is doing that. We need to work together to encourage the other Five Eyes and the like. And I think that that's going to then bring countries like India and like Japan and others together with us. By the way, the Western Pacific, the Chinese floated that. I know Bob knows the story. Decade and a half ago, they proposed to then Commander-in-Chief of Pacific Command, Tim Keating, Admiral Keating, that we'll take the Western Pacific, you take the Eastern Pacific, we'll divide it between us, everything will be nice and copacetic. And he said, no, thanks. And, and that's really the buildup, is to be able to get first the marginal inner seas that Spikeman talked about, and then outwards into where Guam is and over maybe to even Midway area. We're not going to do that, clearly, and they would have a lot of operating difficulties, but they are building a military that can contest in those regions. And that's a great question about the strategic overreach. Paul Kennedy, of course, predicted strategic blowback for the United States and strategic overreach. Chalmers Johnson, of course, popularized the term. I think there's a case to be made that Beijing is, that we've actually seen, if I can pun a little bit, we've seen peaking China already. China has peaked in a way. I actually think that's true. It's clearly peaked economically. We're not going back ever to days of 10% growth or even, 9%, 8% growth. They'll be lucky to get 5% growth or probably lower. And that's official growth. What that actually means, who knows? They have demographic slowdown. They have enormous problems with productivity these days as well. There are always bright spots, but it is reaching a strategic plateauing economically. I think politically it's hit a strategic plateau, and that's in no small part because of the COVID crisis. And then the question is the military side, and the degree to which, by the way, if you have a slowing economy, a macro slowing economy over an extended period of time, how much will you be able to feed that growing military? Those military projections of 2 or 3 aircraft carrier groups, those are really expensive to have. These are expensive weapon systems that it wants. It would be smarter to go with less technologically sophisticated, but more numerous weapon system that could overwhelm our forces. Some of that they do have, the missile boats that I mentioned. But the military as well, once you get to a certain level, you actually, unless you feel you must use it or lose it, you actually become more risk averse. And so there's a question too, as they build up a military that's very expensive and very prominent, how willing they'll be to use it, as opposed to, one aircraft carrier being sunk can change an entire nation's calculation over the costs of what it's doing. So I think it's a good question. It's something that we should think about, because until now, we've only thought about what does a strong China look like? We should be thinking about what does a weak China look like, which can be just as dangerous, just in a different way.
Yeah. Fascinating. We have a question from Carlos Rivers, who asks, who has superiority in space? And I would add to that something on how good is their R&D in terms of, military or space capabilities, or wherever else it might be relevant.
I'm actually not a space expert, and I would pass to Bob if he knows. I think that we know, of course, that they achieved anti-satellite capability well over a decade ago, a decade and a half. It's obviously part of their the capabilities that they would bring to bear. It's probably part of doctrine. We are in a space race. Don't forget, this was the first time we've launched Americans from the United States soil in over a decade. Just happened with the Dragon launch. We're doing it in private-public partnerships. The Chinese are still doing straightforward, old-fashioned government. They want to do a moonshot, government-funded programs. I don't know beyond that, but it's clear that they have considered it important enough that, back in the old days, is there going to be a red communist moon base that's going to launch rockets at America in the 50s. We have to think about actual capabilities that China will bring into space, as well as in the undersea realm, which we sort of also take for granted. It is just as conflicted a realm, and if you can make the undersea area transparent, that gets to strategic communications. It gets to harvesting of vital minerals. It gets obviously to the ability of our forces to operate in a subsea area. All of this is being challenged as it is in the heavens. It's being challenged in the seas by China.
We are officially out of time, but before we close out, I think I'll turn it over to you, Bob and Misha. Is there anything else we haven't talked about? We have a whole list of unanswered questions. Clearly, there's a lot of interest in this topic, but anything you'd like to leave with our audience?
I'll leave with a question, which is the new technology of our era is cyber and digital. We're still in the early cyber digital age. And cyber and digital will ultimately determine military advantage. And so the question becomes, who is more innovative? The United States or China? We have one Silicon Valley that doesn't cooperate very well with our Pentagon. The Chinese are building several that are essentially state-owned and controlled. So we shouldn't assume that we will have the advantage in this new space.
I think this is probably the most important point. We are at risk for certainly the first time since 1945, I would say the first time since the automobile, of not dominating a new technology and inventing its next iterations. We do not have a 5G champion in the United States, let alone a company that builds 5G. This is unprecedented. You don't need 5G to download FPRI webinars more quickly. That's not why you need 5G. 5G, as some people have mentioned, including David Goldman, the Asia Times columnist, and others, it's like the railroads, right? The railroads never made money, but they enabled an entirely new economy to develop. That's what 5G does. It will open up the economy in ways we can't imagine. It will allow for productivity in ways we can't imagine. The Wall Street Journal had a piece just last week saying that American companies don't want to buy, so the Trump administration has tried to get some American companies to maybe buy Nokia or Ericsson so that we would have a 5G champion. And they don't want to do it because it's a low volume business, or it's a low profit business. That is the most myopic, short-sighted, strategically disastrous attitude we could possibly have. Not just because 5G itself is the game changer, but because if you're not doing 5G, you're not going to be leapfrogging into 6G. We cannot have a China that builds the broadband around the world, that sets the 5G standards, that installs the fintech and the e-commerce around the world and locks out American companies, all because we were concerned that it didn't pay the few extra pennies on the dollar to have 5G so that we could download ESPN faster. This to me gets to the core of what the Chinese challenge to the United States is. It might be about the South China Sea. I don't think so, actually. I think it's about who we are as a nation of innovators and entrepreneurs since Benjamin Franklin. Since, by the way, in Philadelphia and the founding of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, or the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. I forget which one's in Philly, I apologize. But founded by Ben Franklin, a society of tinkerers and inventors, from Thomas Edison to Henry Ford to those who built Silicon Valley. Our generation is at risk of letting that go, of saying we're too interested in quarterly profit and not in the 10,000 experiments to make the filament light bulb that changes our economy. This is the most strategic challenge that China faces, is that we are apparently on the cusp of and willing to be simple customers and not inventors and not creators. And if we want to be a country of customers, I guess we can make that choice, but that is not the country that we've been for nearly 250 years. And it will change everything about us and everything that Bob and I and all of us have been talking about what we do in the world. So Bob's point, I think, is actually the most important one that we can talk about today. And it's why the China challenge goes way beyond who builds a base station. It's about who invents, who creates, and who moves society and economy forward.
Thank you, Bob and Misha. I'm sorry we're completely out of time. We're actually over time, but thank you for that last comment. I heard it as both an inspiration and a challenge. Thank you to our audience, our sponsors and supporters. If you're not yet a member and you like what you heard, you learned from what you heard, please consider becoming a member. This video will also be posted. We've recorded it. It'll be posted on the FPRI YouTube channel. So some of us may want to view it again. Really fascinating. And thank you to all your families. Please stay safe, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.